You can start now. Thank you.
Hello, ambassadors, representative of international ideas member states, colleagues and friends from all over the world. I'm Kevin Casas-Zamora, the Secretary General of International IDEA, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this event. At IDEA, we take pride in being an intergovernmental organization that both knows and grows democracy, alongside our longstanding thematic and programmatic expertise in the areas of elections, constitution building, political participation and representation. We have also become a leader in assessing democratic performance. And we do this work not just because it is interesting, but with the aim of better helping democracies to meet their full potential. In this spirit, I am very pleased to be with you today for the special pre-launch presentation of our latest report, the result of a groundbreaking survey on perceptions of democracy among people around the world. Last year, we released our first Perceptions of Democracy survey report, which I encourage you all to check out on our website. Among other things, that report noted two important things. First, that people are generally much more skeptical than experts about the state of democracy in their own countries. And second, that the most marginalized members of societies are the least satisfied with their democracies and the least trusting in its institutions. So this report that we are presenting today builds on that last finding. And we try to unpack the complex intersections between diversity and democracy through the perspectives of the people living at that nexus. In so doing, the report fills out the picture that we started to outline last year. It also aligns with IDEA's advocacy focus this year on the role of inclusion in democracy under the frame of Democracy for All. That has been our advocacy campaign throughout the year. So in a few minutes, you will hear more about the survey findings from the authors of this new report, my dear colleagues, Michael Rooney and Emma Kenny. After that, we'll enjoy a moderated discussion featuring valuable perspectives on the theme of diversity and democracy. We'll have with us, we're lucky for that, Dr. Noah El-Mikawi, the Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo, and Ahmed Abdirahman, founder and CEO of Järvaveckan Foundation in Sweden. But first, I want to underscore why the approach in this survey is so innovative and so important for how we think about and support democracy. As many of you know, International IDEA's Global State of Democracy initiative provides data and evidence-based analysis on the quality of democracy globally. The survey that you will hear about today was also global. But while the Global State of Democracy initiative is a quantitative and qualitative assessment of how democracy is faring based on complex indicators and expert sources, the Perceptions of Democracy survey draws on input from a different kind of democracy practitioner, namely the citizen. As I mentioned earlier, citizens often have quite different perceptions of democracy in their countries based on their own lived experiences than the experts do based on the data. And since it is all citizens, not just the experts who vote in democracies, I would contend that their perception probably matters rather more for what we do. Those of us striving to advance and protect democracy should reflect this reality across our work. This survey highlights the need for a systematic effort to understand and improve the perception of democracy in the eyes of its most important stakeholders, the people. It is well nigh impossible to protect democracy around the world, which is what we're all trying to do here, if we don't better understand what's in the mind of citizens when they think about democracy. And this is certainly true when it comes to diversity. At a time of increased attention and concern to security needs, there is a risk that diversity may be portrayed as a threat to national cohesion, for example, and thus to democratic resilience. Perhaps because certain groups are alleged to be less inclined to democracy. Such suggestions are mistaken, as this report shows. Actually, far from being an impediment to democratic resilience, diversity is an enabler of it. Building sustainable, resilient democracies requires inclusive reforms and institutions that enjoy widespread support of all citizens, not only dominant social groups. And although this report focuses on 6 countries, namely Brazil, Colombia, India, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and the United States, we believe its lessons are relevant globally. Our panelists today from Egypt and Sweden can attest to this. The evidence-driven call to action in this report is an excellent example of the value generated by the core contribution of international ideas member states, which allow us to launch initiatives such as this one. We are now looking for partners so we can make the survey that led to last year's report and to this one, the first in a series that tracks public perceptions over time. If inclusive, representative democracy matters to you and you would like to join us in that mission, please reach out to us. Ultimately, the measure of a survey's value lies in the value of what it measures. And this survey measures the only way a democracy can truly be strong, by building up public trust and by bringing everyone along. Its findings offer valuable new guidance for our shared work to strengthen democracy worldwide. Once again, thank you for being here, and I now yield the floor to Michael and Emma. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and good afternoon to you all. Thank you again from Emma and I for taking the time to attend. And now I will walk us through the first part of this latest Perceptions of Democracy survey report, Diversity, Democracy, and Politics Along Many Lines. First, I'm going to explain a few things about our presentation today, which will run for around 20 minutes. So we'll give you a brief overview of the Perceptions of the Democracy survey project, as well as discuss the specific findings of this report before turning it over to our panelists who will be discussing the implications more broadly. So, PODS is a survey of 19 countries from around the world that are covered on the themes listed here on this screen. So the purpose of this project is to provide a counterweight to expert-led and defined assessments of democracy, as well as for how marginalized groups in societies view them the same. So the questions that we covered in this report are more specifically, First and foremost, how free and fair respondents found the most recent national electoral cycle to be, how they saw the value of voting, whether they find that courts provide equal and fair access to justice, their satisfaction with the national government, and finally, whether they enjoy their social and economic rights, in one way of describing it, and whether they believe that they themselves are doing better than their parents. So, of the 19 countries, how did we choose these 6? So we chose six democracies that we could place in pairs for comparison. India and the US as their large, diverse federal democracies, Sierra Leone and Senegal, multi-ethnic, post-colonial West African states, and Brazil and Colombia, which are 2 racially mixed Latin American democracies. And so before we get into the results, we wanted to make a brief note of what we mean in this and in previous pause reports when we use a term like minority. Self-identified minorities, we've discovered in our research, tend to overlap less with census-defined minority groups than one would commonly assume. So although, as Kevin discussed, self-identified minorities perceive more obstacles in assessing democratic institutions, they're more doubtful about their performance than members of majority groups. The people in these groups are not always who one thinks. To take examples from our survey, 2/3 of Black Americans identified themselves as minorities in a country where about 13.5% are members of that group. In Sierra Leone, both the dominant Mende and Tembe are both between 30 and 35%, and 1/3 of them identified themselves as minorities. And in India, where Hindus make an overwhelming portion of the population, only half of Indian Muslims describe themselves as such. So this mismatch between self-perception, so to speak, and as a minority and being a member of such a group is something we ask people to keep in mind throughout this hour. It's relevant when we start looking at other divisions that we cover in the report, such as between urban and rural respondents and so on. So what we're trying to say is we must understand how we see our fellow citizens, how they see themselves, and how they are seen by the state in censuses, surveys, and statistics are frequently not one and the same. So now on to the key findings of the report. So the first 2 countries we're going to discuss in our groups of 3 are India and the United States. So if we begin with the US, we find that what divides the perceptions of Americans' democratic institutions is not so much race or religion, but geography. So if you look at the left side of your screen here, we show how respondents differed in their responses to the various questions that we asked, depending on whether they identified as being from a city or from a rural area. And on the right, we see the same questions and the same responses, but instead divided by race. We have Black, Hispanic, and white. There are other ethnicities in the United States, but in some of these, we didn't always get enough responses to use in the report. So on the latter, we find that Americans are, in the latter group, when we divide Americans by race, we find that Americans are quite united in their perceptions of how their government and their democratic institutions function. The 2 exceptions are the questions of economic progress between generations and satisfaction with the governments. On both of those, white respondents are significantly less likely than others to answer positively. To put that in another way, if we ask Black and Hispanic Americans, they generally find themselves to be doing better than their parents. White Americans disagree. To harp a little bit on the divide on the left between urban and rural respondents, we don't see in our survey results that it's reducible to economic class. We can also divide Americans in the pause report into a oversample of the lowest income distribution and the rest of the country. And this gap that we see here between urban and rural largely disappears. There's also a major challenge in determining who counts as rural in the United States. So if you know a lot about the United States, you might be thinking of political narratives around the left behind white rural Americans. The United States has competing national measures that frequently do not map onto popular conceptions of urban and rural. So return to the message at the beginning. We find these minority statuses and statuses of marginalization to be highly subjective, and and we do see a lot of overlap with identifiers such as white, rural, working class, and support for Donald Trump, right-wing politics in general, and skepticism of democracy in our in our survey data. So what we're asking here is, not just, we're asking how people perceive the world, not how the external world perceives them. Now, if we compare the United States to India, these divisions that we've just discussed on geographic and economic lines are much less marked. On every question, we do see that Hindus respond more positively to these questions than other minority groups. We have significant data for Christians and Muslims in India, although the gaps are not as large as those that we observe in the United States. Lower income respondents similarly are more critical in a similar manner as the divide that we see here on our screen between religious groups. Another finding we'd like to highlight from the USA is that it is the only country in the data set where respondents writ large were more likely than not to say they were worse off more economically than their parents. However, as you may have, for those of you who were paying attention during the last slide, however, Black and low income American responses are much more in line with what we see in the rest of the world. That is to say, Black Americans and low income Americans generally find themselves to be doing better than their parents. This is part of a broader trend we see in America, where there has been in recent years a significant disconnect between what we can observe as economic outcomes and the perceptions of those economic outcomes. The latter are, of course, mediated through expectations, media effects themselves, and numerous other social forces. So despite what we see as an outlier case of the United States, it is very difficult to discern how much of this is actually individuals' economic relative decline, and how much of it is real and how much it is strictly a matter of their perceptions. When we put them side by side in the United States, in both countries, we see gaps in the perceptions of access to justice. Both Black Americans and Muslim Indians have significantly less trust in free and fair access to courts than Hindu Indians and white Americans. In India, there exists a similar economic divide on this question, whereas we say that low-income Indians feel that they have significantly more obstacles to access to justice. With regards to India, in case someone is thinking of asking this question, we could conceivably, as Kevin said, we would like to run additional versions of this survey in the future. We might be able to shed additional light on this if we were able to obtain a significantly large sample size to address this by caste or other social divisions, but that is not something that features in the report. And with that overview of the US and India, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Emma to take us forward. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you to all for joining us today. The next two countries that we're going to discuss are Sierra Leone and Senegal. Our survey findings show deep ethnic polarization in Sierra Leone, mainly between the two main ethnic groups, the Mende and the Temne. These divisions, as you can see to the left, shape views on electoral quality, satisfaction with government, performance, and economic progress. Senegal, however, tells us a different story. Despite similar ethnic diversity, we see almost no such divides in this country, or if we do, to quite a minimal degree. In Senegal, the absence of these ethnic divisions could be explained by the country's long history of building a civic national identity, rooted in its colonial and post-independence experiences. Political differences there also do appear to be driven more by geography and income rather than ethnicity. In Sierra Leone, the divisions seem to reflect entrenched ethno-political alignments, along what we see is a north-south Temne-Mende ethnic axis, which is also rooted in the legacy of civil conflict. These divisions also seem to be preserved today through ethnic loyalty networks, which tie electoral victory to the provision of state goods. Interestingly, while Sierra Leone shows ethnic splits on electoral credibility, as you saw in the previous slide, all groups in both countries actually agree that voting matters. Now, this shows us that there is this foundational belief in democratic participation, and it's quite encouraging to see this. Both countries also share low confidence in their courts, and this is especially the case among minorities. Again, we see Sierra Leone exhibit some significant ethnic divisions, whereas Senegal does not. Now let's take a look at our next and last set of comparisons, which is Brazil and Colombia. On average, Brazilians view their democracy more positively than Colombians. Many respondents in Brazil reported that they were better off than their parents. So we have this sense of upward mobility. In Colombia, however, this optimism was less pronounced, and it varied between groups, which might be also explained by the legacy of historical violence there. And this is also particularly acute among low-income individuals. Like Senegal's emphasis on civic nation building, Brazil's past narrative of a so-called racial democracy, and whether that's fully realized or not, appears to potentially foster norms against exclusion. And this could suggest that even symbolic commitments to equality might play a role in shaping favorable public perceptions. In Brazil, the main cleavage that we see is religious. Protestant respondents expressed significantly more skepticism about electoral credibility and their government performance than Catholics and non-religious groups. We believe this finding is likely reflects partisan alignments more so than any religious divisions, as evangelical Protestants were a major source of support for former President Bolsonaro, who lost the 2022 election, which is the election that POD's respondents were being asked to consider at the time. While no divisions between religious or racial groups were observed in Colombia, it's worth noting that the country did have the overall lowest mean score in the data set on this question of electoral credibility. We also saw that rural respondents were also slightly more likely than urban respondents to assess the most recent election as fair. This finding could also potentially be a result of President Gustavo Petro's relatively stronger performance in rural Colombia than his opponent in the 2022 election, for speculation. When it comes to perceptions on the value of voting, both countries showed no major divides by race, religion, or geography. Still, Colombia's overall mean score was again the lowest in the data set, but this was also tied with the United States. Okay, so what do these paired comparisons tell us? Firstly, diversity is not inherently divisive, or in other words, social divisions do not always translate into political divisions, as shown in the contrasting examples of Sierra Leone and Senegal, as well as Brazil and Colombia. Instead, the findings suggest that social differences can become divisive under certain conditions. And for example, when elites have incentives to foster them, or when certain democratic or political institutions lack the strength to counteract or constrain these forces. Secondly, dissatisfaction with democratic institutions, which we also saw was frequently more prevalent among minorities, does not necessarily indicate dissatisfaction with democracy itself. In fact, many members of minority and otherwise disadvantaged groups were quite positive when surveyed in this report on this question, viewing voting as a meaningful avenue for impacting the government. And as mentioned earlier, this is an encouraging sign. Thirdly, Breaking down data by social groups is essential to identifying inequalities and spotting institutional failures, as well as to designing policies to address these issues. Across many countries, we find that detailed demographic data is often lacking or entirely insufficient. And addressing these gaps remains a critical task. And finally, while our report focuses on 6 countries, the lessons are global. Democracies that ultimately embrace pluralism, we believe, are stronger, are more resilient, and are better equipped to solve the complex world problems that we all deal with today. With that, I want to thank you very much for your time. And I will now turn the floor over to our Director of Global Programs, Katarzyna Gardabkadze, who will moderate the panel discussion. Over to you, Katarzyna.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you and Mike for presenting. Maybe before I start, I will just encourage colleagues and our participants online, if you have any questions to our experts, our panelists, to please pose these questions in the chat. I will just maybe start with a personal reflection. I just came back from a discussion on democratic resilience in Switzerland, and there was a debate as to whether public perceptions should be considered in the context of democratic resilience. And for me, both the previous pods and this one shows very clearly that it's a pillar of equal importance as the state of institutions and the quality of democratic systems and processes. Because at the end of the day, if the population doesn't believe in either neither the institutions nor the systems and processes, then who do we build democratic resilience for? But I would like to ask you, and maybe I will ask with Dr. El-Mikabi, what was the most striking or the most important finding of this report and why? And also, already jumping to the second question, how do you think the findings of this report should change the way we think about the role of pluralism and diversity and democracy?
Thank you very much, first of all, for a very good and succinct summary of the report and its findings, and for inviting me to be part of this extremely important conversation. I commend International IDEA for choosing that focus. Inclusive democracy is and has always been, since the Second World War ended, a very important project that inspired social democracy worldwide, and that inspired and has driven democratic welfare states. A good example thereof is Sweden and Europe. But now, the reason why I commend you even more is that now inclusive democracy is challenged by identity politics worldwide that are giving so much fodder and ammunition to the politics of fear. And politics of fear based on the instrumentalization of our diverse identities is affecting domestic politics worldwide and threatening democracy worldwide, and is also affecting the politics of fear, international politics. And that's challenging trade, globalization, as well as international law, when fear drives behavior that violates international law worldwide. So congratulations on choosing a pivotal question to ask about diversity. Is it a threat? And your answer is no, it isn't. It's what we make of it and how we manage it. And that resonates very much with the region I come from, the Middle East and North Africa. I'll give you one example of how that resonates. I will answer to your question about what were the findings I found mostly resonating, and I'll try to give very telegraphic examples from my region that second and strengthen some of your findings. One important reason why your choice of topic this time around resonates has to do with one fundamental crisis that is challenging my region. And that crisis is focused on the Israel-Palestine challenge that we all face around the world. This challenge has changed from being a political dispute over land, where international law was a main, not always successfully utilized, but a main tool employed in this political dispute. This has changed now into a religious dispute over land, where both sides to the dispute are provoking and invoking God to grab land or to resist the grabbing of land. And when you invoke God, you invoke a very, very fundamental element of identity. I'll pause here. I'm not going to dwell more on this crisis, but just to tell you that one of the most fundamental crises shaping the region today is a crisis that has moved from being a political dispute where international law was employed to an identity dispute. And that's where all of us are struggling, and struggling deeply. Let me get back to the findings that resonate more widely in our region. One of the most interesting and pivotal findings in your report is that you're saying diversity in and of itself does not lead to the threat to democracy, because what we need to do is focus on the why institutions and how institutions manage or mismanage diversity. Your findings alert us to the importance of the national narrative. Sierra Leone is a good case in that. The national narrative means we need to worry about who constitutes national narratives. And these are not only politicians, these are cultural activists, these are journalists, and many, many, many other actors. When the national narrative creates harmony, we are better off than without such a national narrative. Another finding of yours is institutional inclusion, and that puts a lot of pressure on our institutional designers across the world. I'll give you two examples from my region that resonates with this finding. After after the American invasion of Iraq and the start of the nation and state building project in Iraq, writing a new constitution for Iraq was an important institutional design moment. And part of it was to manage the diversity of Iraq, a society with three main ethnic populations that have different access to institutions and to economic resources. Another good example from my region that you may want to look at with respect to institutional design is Lebanon. Years at the end of the civil war in Lebanon in the early 90s, an agreement was arrived at, and this agreement is called the Ta'if Agreement. It was an institutional design that distributed political power among Lebanon's various diverse groups. History will tell us whether the Iraqi case of institutional design and the Lebanese case of institutional design was good or bad. I think the answer is, in my opinion, a mixture of both. And this is an important moment now for Syria, that is trying to build its own institutional design, either to manage its own diversity, and it's a highly diverse society, or mismanage it. The third interesting finding of yours that resonates with my region is socioeconomic distributions, which overlap sometimes with geography, whether it's rural, urban, or otherwise. Distributive politics is an important harmonizing factor, an equalizing and democratizing factor. Socioeconomic policies are still key in my region. And I'll alert you to an important fact that even as many around the world have declared the Arab Spring dead upon arrival, we are in the final weeks, in the last few weeks, looking at a country like Morocco, considered economically a successful case of integration into the world economy, with many street demonstrations that are driven by socioeconomic vulnerabilities, which reminds us yet again that the Arab Spring started in Tunisia, followed by Egypt, and it was socioeconomic issues that drove those. Hence, it stays as an important driver where diversity, when it overlaps with socioeconomic inequalities, it becomes a threat. And finally, your findings are saying to us something extremely important, that there is something called elite choice. The choice of leaders to instrumentalize and politicize diversity is important, which at the end of the day takes us back to accountability. And this is something that Syrian civil society today is asking all the international community to help keep on top of its list. If you deal with Syria, because Syria needs to be stabilized, because of the bigger Middle East conflict, please do not forget to keep the Syrian leadership accountable, to manage the Syrian diversity better. I cannot congratulate you enough, and I'll stop very shortly, for focusing on this issue. As I was trying to say in my very short intervention, it resonates deeply with things that we all care about in democratic emerging democracies and non-democracies alike. Dissatisfaction with performance of democracy doesn't at all mean anywhere across the globe necessarily dissatisfaction with the values and principles. And that I see in my fellows in Egypt as much as in my fellows in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Syria, and elsewhere in the region. Congratulations. All the best for this report and more. Back to you.
Thank you very much. I actually would like to ask for your permission to use the quote diversity is what we make of it and how we manage it in a LinkedIn post that I will have for this publication. I think it's critically important. I do remember from my own country, Holland, how when narrative changed from being inclusive and being for equality and being promoting diversity to calling migrants parasites, then it brought a whole different perspectives for the people as well. And it led to quite striking acts of violence in situations that otherwise would just not even be a situation. German professor phenomenon being speak of diversity on a public tram in the center of the capital because he spoke German. So it is critically important, and the national narrative is critically important indeed. And I cannot agree more with everything that you said. I also noticed what you talked about when you talked about socioeconomic distribution. There has just recently been yet another G20 accompanying report about the effects of inequality on the outlook for the world, a report that went mostly unnoticed, and yet it is probably one of the most critical issues that we are facing today. So thank you very much for this very thoughtful intervention, and I will now turn to Ahmed with the same questions. What you found the most striking in our findings, and how do you think they should change the way we think about diversity in democracy?
First of all, thank you also for this very interesting to say the least report and the way you guys have taken on a very challenging but quite important subject. Democracy, as we all know, is dependent on the citizens. It has to have foundation in our citizens. It's the ground. And if we divide our citizens in by division and by making some of them stand out as a threat, of course, that will have a huge impact on our democracy. So thank you for taking on that. What I find interesting is also that you looked at very different countries. It's easy sometimes to say that the US is a historical bound with slavery and all these things. Of course, you will see a difference a certain way. But given that you have done various different countries in various parts of the world and come to similar conclusion in all of them, also shows that this is not something is defined only by one historical event or historical country. This is about democracy in a global level. So that I find it very interesting and very encouraging. And I also want to say thank you to for your remarks, Dr. El Makawi. I hope I say that after name right. But it really shows that as you touch on all the challenges that we are seeing in a global level. I myself have a Somali background. I came to Sweden as a refugee, and I will try to speak from the European perspective and the Nordic perspective, given that you already covered a lot of the other part of the world. As you all know, we're seeing in Europe the same situation where diversity is seen as a threat. And I wish I could say that this has happened for the past 10 years or 20 years, but as we all know, this has been brewing all the time. But those voices that are now pushing for division are no longer hiding behind screens and behind alleys. They are now in the streets. They now have a voice in a very different way than ever before. So it is very worrying that where we always see democracy as the strongest, and where we have seen historically democracy to be the birthplace of democracy in Europe, if we should say that, is how at least is perceived within our democratic countries in Europe, that this is where democracy was founded, that even here it's not, it's under threat. And it has the potential to not only destroy itself, but also destroy a big part of the world, because the strongest countries right now, from the US, India, as you already mentioned, also one of the biggest democracy in the world, to now Europe, it will have an impact around the world. So what do we do in Europe? Others are looking at that and saying, is this a solution? So that's, I think, is also interesting to view from that perspective. I actually like the idea, and I want to push the idea that without having data, it's difficult also to show the facts. And now in Europe, probably, as you already mentioned, other part of the world, lack of data and lack of the chance to bring all these different voices and have them say what they want to say is big problem. For example, the work that we are doing in Sweden is kind of similar. We are giving a voice to groups in society that feel marginalized, that feel that they are not represented when surveys are being done, and they are always talked about rather than talked with. And our data is showing similar to yours, that when you look at how people feel and think, they are not very different from each other. People feel that socioeconomic inequalities are a bigger problem than what you have in your head or the way you pray or who you pray to. So even here we see that the social economic inequalities are common, no matter where you are or what your background is. But by bringing these people and giving them a voice, and by comparing we did now, which we'll release next week, 5,000 interviews in Sweden with people who don't live in socioeconomic disadvantaged areas and people who live in socioeconomic disadvantaged areas where majority of the population have immigrant backgrounds, mostly non-European background from Middle East, Africa. And what we're seeing is that quite actually shocking, because sometimes people expect it to be different, that we don't want democracy, that we don't want rule of law, that we don't share democratic values. And it's the opposite. We are more in common than what the difference is. Where the difference comes in is the economic situation and the sense of security, both in terms of income, housing, but also security in terms of fear of criminality, fear of physical violence. So it's very interesting to see same data basically in everywhere as we are now looking at these two different sets of data. So I think this is very, very interesting and very encouraging. And what I take away from this and what I want to leave you with is that we have to speak up. We have to show this data. We have to share this data. And we have to show that diversity is not a threat to democracy. And we are not so different that living together is impossible. If we have lost that, how do you say, struggle or that narrative, if few of them convince the majority that living together is impossible because we are so different, because of the skin of our colors, the God that we pray to, whatever it is, then we have lost democracy. And I'm very much afraid that the good people of us are not speaking out right now. And we are letting others talk in this narrative that it's impossible and we should give up and we should send everybody back home, basically. So I'm worried about that, and I hope that together we can show that whether it be in Europe, in Sweden, or Nordics, or anywhere else in the world, diversity is a strength and it's important foundation of our democracy, for our economy, and for humanity itself. Is the reason why this species is still here, because of our ability to work together. So I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you leaving us with the thought that we are not so different. And again, speaking about the importance of the narrative and the narrative of the other, and how this narrative of the other being a threat has become normalized, and how dangerous that is. But I also really appreciate your example of bringing up voices from people who would normally not be heard, or be heard only on the margins and as an afterthought. And I note what you said about the sense of security or insecurity that they have. And I also notice how the sense of insecurity is being weaponized by those who are against diversity and who are also contesting democratic values. I wanted to quickly ask you a follow-up question. So what can we do? What kind of actions do you think our findings can inspire in your context or in your field? And I will again go back to Dr. El-Mikawi, because I know your time is limited. You need to unmute.
About that. Thank you for giving us this second and final round of reflections. One very immediate and concrete thought has to do with the issue of data, which my distinguished colleague has alluded to. The data related to diversity is very sensitive data in many countries. And the result of that is it limits very much international ideas' ability to scale up its report for this year, because either the data is not available, or if it is available, it's not looked upon as an easy thing to give access to the data and to make the results or the analysis an issue for a conversation. So I just say, yes, data is very important to drive a reasonable and rational conversation, but regrettably, data is politicized as well. And sometimes the feel of threat is wrapped up in conversations around sovereignty. So we have to do something about that. And it's not only related to this issue, just so that I relativize my point a little bit. I circulate in other circles of scholars, such as those working in issues related to environmental sustainability and climate change, and they also worry that data there is also politicized around the conversations of how to measure loss and damage, and accordingly how to argue or negotiate for financing. So the issue of data is becoming more political and less technical than we think, and we need somehow together to wrap our heads around this, because it has to drive our conversations. And I agree very much with my colleague on that. Second and final point of reflection I'd like to make is maybe it would be important to work with other partners to do series of launches of your report in different regions or sub-regions of the world, to see what are your colleagues in those regions and sub-regions already doing in relation to the issue of diversity, plurality of identities, and the sustainability of democracy and its future. It's, as I said earlier, a very important issue. And hence, regional and sub-regional conversations between your teams and think tanks, research institutions in those other regions of the world is pivotal to build a community of solidarity, and to inspire us all to continue to think along those lines for the sake of democracy in the future. Back to you.
Thank you very much. You speak my heart, I would say, when you speak about the importance of partnership and the importance of building solidarity in the community. I actually had a discussion yesterday when I said that if we lose one actor in the pro-diversity universe, we shake the entire architecture. So solidarity and working together to find solutions is very important. We also discussed this internally. It is really important to show good examples and bring them up more, and to show the data that is not counter to something, but is just producing a different narrative. So I'll go now to Ahmed with the same question. What can we do?
Thank you again. I think that what we need is to make sure that we don't only, how do you say, guard or develop good policies and laws and social contracts and in terms of, you know, protecting our democracy. So it's not changeable overnight. That's also, of course, a real threat, sadly. Democracy is good also when it's low. But now everybody wants to go fast, and that's very, very dangerous. But what I want to say is that it's not enough to have amazing policies, it's not enough to have good laws, and it's not enough to have enough data and research, which I think both of us also work a lot. All of us here are interested in data and everything else. I think the most crucial thing on top of that, when you have the data, is to create meetings between people. We have to meet, we have to see each other as human beings, and we have to not rely on our algorithms and our social media, and also not only on what we are able to read or not read, even if it's trusted media. So the future of our democracy rests on that we are interacting with our citizens, and our citizens of diversity from every walk of life, those who've been here a generation, for example, now in Europe, and us who only interact and meet, live together, work together. And if that doesn't happen, which we are seeing more and more now, segregation, it will further the problems that we are seeing. So I want to leave with you that create reasons for people to meet, and we are trying to do that. We annually gather 40,000 people for 4 days, Göra veckan, a political democracy festival with all the political leaders of Sweden, major business leaders, civil society, government, in an area that is socioeconomically disadvantaged. And we bring those who have, how do you say, power to effect, to be places where the power is lacking most of the time. And we show them that the people here with diversity are also voters. They are also people who have to go and buy stuff. They are economic opportunity here. It's the only way to do that is to create meetings. So let's do that together to create more meetings between people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We still have 5 minutes, so if there are any questions from the audience, we can encourage one question now. But I also would like to thank you for what you said, not only about your gatherings, but I pick up 2 things that I think are really very important. We have actually discussed this here. We seem to have lost an ancient and invaluable art of dialoguing about issues and not about identities and about blame. And I think bringing back this dialogue is, as you say, is critically really important. And I also note what you said about bringing those who can make decisions to those who usually do not have voice. I recall from my personal experience a situation in which I brought decision makers from a ministry on wheelchairs to navigate the difficulties of daily life in a city so that they could make better policies. And it did change their perspective dramatically. So indeed, an ability to put yourself in the shoes of those you are supposedly represent is probably very important. I do not think we have questions, and because we have 3 minutes to finish, maybe I will ask my colleagues if they would like to offer some final reflection from what the panelists have said. Mike?
No, I want to say thank you. We're happy that this, we're happy that the survey and the reports that we've been able to write on it have provoked such interesting reflections and thoughts. And I think we agree, and we hope that this is a message that is taken forward at the importance of paying attention to how different groups in societies see the functioning of their democratic institutions, not as a way of assigning this, taking this to the realm of specifically identity politics, but taking it out of finding ways that we can both through institutions and of course through politics itself, a way out of these various democratic crises that we've discussed today. Because as Katarzyna says, and as everyone has said here, like some of these things are things that we can work with in the terms of the institutions that we at IDEA work with, electoral commissions, parliaments. But in some cases, it is going to remain a political issue. So it cannot stay here in these expert circles. It needs to be taken out into the public through, what was the exact word that you used? It was very nice. Through cultural leaders in a way to make this a topic of national conversation. And we hope that we can be a little part, at least, of making that happen. I think I've eaten up our time now, so I has something you want to add, you can, but otherwise.
Yeah, I think we can go with concluding remarks because
Yes.
we're over.
I will. I don't really know that I have much to add to a very rich contribution from both our experts. I want to thank you very much for sharing sharing your thoughts. If I want to leave us all with one thought, and Dr. Mikawi, your Israel-Palestine example brought it very close to home, is that we will only be able to make the change if we all live up to what we preach. Democracy has to be lived. It cannot be just stated. And I think that is an important message for all of us. What you suggested in terms of launches and dialogues around the findings, we would very much hope to do that. But I also take notice of what you said, that as much as data is important, funding for data doesn't seem to be a priority these days, and we do hope to find support of our member states and our partners in really taking this message forward. We would very much encourage all of you to share the findings of this report through your networks and through your channels, because the more we can get it out there, the better off we will be in our ability to generate meaningful discussion. And I would really like to thank both of you for your contributions, our audience to being with us. And I have to say, I would be very happy to be a part of your 40,000 gatherings one time in history, because that seems like a phenomenal dialogue platform in action. So thank you all very much. And I really look forward to continuing distributing and discussing the findings of this very important report.